It looked like cinema's ultimate paradox, a film about chaos that demanded absolute discipline, a story about survival where its stars could barely survive each other. On the endless desert roads of Mad Max Fury Road, Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy became legends on screen. She was Furiosa, driven by a quiet fury. He was Max, scarred, feral, a loner in a world on fire. Together, they gave us images burned into history. But behind those images lived another war. Theron arrived on set like a soldier. She believed in order, in schedules, and preparation. Hardy lived inside unpredictability. He came late, he came unready, and he believed that out of the storm came truth. What happens when a perfectionist meets a man who thrives on chaos? The desert heat did not forgive. Cameras rolled for months. The silence between them grew sharper than the roar of any engine. When the crew whispered, it was not about the explosions or the stunts. It was about the looks that cut across the set, the words spoken in anger, the standoff that turned a masterpiece into a minefield. How do two actors create a film about survival while destroying their own peace? And why, even years later, does this clash still echo louder than the engines of Fury Road?
The beginning was not supposed to be war. George Miller, the quiet architect behind the madness, had envisioned balance. He placed Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy at the center of his vision, two magnetic forces destined to pull audiences into his world of dust and blood. To him, it was a marriage of contrasts. She brought experience, discipline, and a presence honed from years of carrying films on her shoulders. He carried rawness, an untamed instinct that Hollywood had begun to worship. On paper, it was chemistry waiting to ignite. Theron had walked through fire before. She had built her career from grit and survival, moving from South Africa to Hollywood, enduring rejection until her talent could no longer be ignored. Hardy had risen differently, a storm from Britain, carrying roles that blurred the line between menace and vulnerability. Their pairing looked like destiny, yet destiny can fracture. Fury Road was not an ordinary production. It was a shoot that devoured time, money, and sanity. Months stretched into years. Crews lived in the desert, watching their world build from scrap metal and sweat. Every day became survival, not only for the characters, but for the people bringing them to life. And inside that crucible, differences that might have been minor in another setting began to widen. Theron's insistence on order made sense in chaos. Hardy's refusal to bow to order felt like rebellion. At first, the rift was invisible. No one spoke of it. But as cameras rolled, the silence thickened. What began as discomfort would soon sharpen into open hostility. The tragedy was this. Miller had asked his actors to embody struggle, to play out a journey where trust was fragile and survival demanded unity. Instead, he watched as his leads lived out a different truth, one where trust collapsed and unity shattered. What the world would one day see as a masterpiece was in the moment a battlefield. This was not just about two actors with different methods. It was about two worlds colliding, two visions of how art should be made. And when such visions clash, the dust they raised never fully settles.
Every feud begins with something small, a look held too long, a silence that feels louder than words. On the scorched set of Fury Road, the first cracks between Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy appeared not with shouts, but with lateness. Theron treated the set like a battlefield where time mattered. She arrived early, ready, prepared down to the last detail. Hardy did not. He came late, often by hours, drifting in as if the desert belonged to him. To some, it was a quirk. To Theron, it was a declaration. In her eyes, every delay was disrespect, not just to her, but to the hundreds of crew members standing in the heat waiting for their star. At first, she bit her tongue. This was the code she lived by. Be professional, keep your anger in check, let the work speak. But Fury Road was not a film of quiet patience. It demanded stamina, precision, trust. And each time Hardy appeared late, the trust eroded. Crew members whispered. Tension clung to the air. What had once been silent irritation grew into open resentment. Hardy, for his part, saw things differently. To him, his process required unpredictability. He thrived on rawness. If he came in disheveled, still wrestling with his own storms, it was not disrespect, it was fuel. He wanted chaos to bleed into his performance. He believed that cinema was not about perfection, but about truth pulled from the dirt. And for him, that truth could not arrive on schedule. This difference in philosophy was gasoline. Theron wanted discipline, Hardy wanted fire. The set gave them both. Soon, scenes that should have been smooth became jagged. Their characters, already written as reluctant allies, carried the weight of their off-screen disdain. When Furiosa glared at Max, it was no longer acting. When Max looked away, silent and hostile, it was no longer scripted. The crew began to take sides, though quietly. Some admired Hardy's raw talent, his ability to channel chaos into something magnetic. Others respected Theron's command, her refusal to let discipline slip. But most felt the tension like a storm cloud that never moved. Every morning brought the same question. Would Hardy show up? And when he did, what battlefield would they walk into? The breaking point came during a scene where timing was everything. The crew had prepared for hours, the desert sun climbing higher, sweat dripping from every brow. Theron arrived early, armored with patience that was running thin. Hardy did not. Minutes turned into hours. When he finally arrived, disheveled and unapologetic, the dam broke. Theron unleashed her anger. Not a private confrontation, but a public reckoning. She called out the lateness, the disrespect, the toll it took on every soul under that sun. Hardy, never one to retreat, fired back. Voices rose, eyes burned, and for the first time, the feud was undeniable. It was no longer about lateness. It was about two stars locked in a war of respect. That day did not end with resolution. It ended with silence, sharper than before, heavier than the desert air. And in that silence, the crew knew. This was no longer a clash of methods. This was a fracture that would define the entire shoot. George Miller, a director known for patience, tried to let it pass. He believed that tension could serve the film, that real hostility might give authenticity to the uneasy alliance between Furiosa and Max. Perhaps, in some ways, he was right. On screen, their mistrust radiated truth, but off-screen, the cost was mounting. Every glare, every word left unsaid, every delayed call time stacked like bricks in a wall too heavy to move. In the desert, there are no shadows to hide behind. Everything is exposed. By the end of those first weeks, the cracks were visible to all. Theron, once measured, now bristled with impatience. Hardy, once untamed, now dug deeper into defiance. The war had begun, not with a script or a camera, but with time itself. And time, as they would both learn, is a battlefield that never forgives.
Tension, if left to simmer, always finds a stage. For Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy, that stage came one morning, when the desert heat had already begun to suffocate the crew. The scene was critical, a sequence that demanded both stars at their sharpest. Theron arrived on time, ready, armored with patience that had been fraying for weeks. Hardy did not. Hours passed. The crew shifted uncomfortably, whispers rising. The set was money burning by the minute. When Hardy finally appeared, it was as if he had stepped into a storm waiting just for him. Theron did not wait. She confronted him in front of the entire crew, her voice sharp, her frustration undeniable. She accused him of disrespect, of wasting not only her time, but the time of every person who had been waiting under the relentless sun. It was a line in the sand, and she drew it boldly. Hardy, cornered but defiant, did not retreat. He erupted. He shouted back, raw venom in his words. He called her controlling, accused her of killing the creative spark. To him, her discipline was a prison. To her, his chaos was sabotage. The crew froze. Cameras did not roll. For a moment, it felt less like a film set and more like a battlefield with no script. This confrontation marked the point of no return. Until then, their feud had lived in silences, in glances, in the unspoken weight that dragged at every call time. Now it was undeniable. The crew had seen it, Miller had seen it, and from that day on, the set split into two realities. On one side, the fictional wasteland of Fury Road, on the other, the very real wasteland of a broken working relationship.
For Theron, the public explosion was both necessary and costly. She could no longer mask her contempt. She demanded accountability even at the price of harmony. Hardy, wounded and enraged, doubled down on defiance. He began retreating deeper into his own space, carrying the hostility like armor. The glances between them became daggers. Their dialogue and character dripped with subtext, too sharp to be entirely fiction. Whispers reached beyond the desert. Hollywood loves stories of chaos, and the tension on Fury Road became a quiet legend before the film was even finished. Some crew members spoke of feeling caught in a crossfire, forced to choose sides without ever saying so aloud. Others admitted that the feud gave the film its pulse. The mistrust between Max and Furiosa felt real because it was real. But authenticity comes at a cost. The outburst had left scars, not only between the actors but across the entire crew. The air of dread each morning grew heavier. Would Hardy arrive on time, or would another eruption shatter the fragile calm? Would Theron hold her tongue, or would the desert echo with another war of words? George Miller, a director who believed in patience, tried to shield his vision from the storm. He urged his stars to channel the hostility into their characters. Yet even he could not ignore that something had broken. The bond between his leads was fractured, perhaps beyond repair. Still, he pressed forward, knowing that masterpieces are often born in fire. The irony was brutal. Fury Road was a story about reluctant allies forced to trust each other against impossible odds. On screen, Max and Furiosa were bound by survival. Off-screen, Theron and Hardy could barely stand the sight of one another. The camera captured their mistrust, their anger, their silence. And in doing so, it captured something more powerful than acting. It captured truth. For audiences, that truth would one day feel electric. But for those who lived it, it was poison. The public explosion had turned whispers into certainty. This was no passing clash of styles. This was open war. And the desert, vast and unforgiving, gave them no escape. By the time the dust settled from that day, the damage was done. The crew walked on eggshells. The atmosphere was brittle. Theron and Hardy no longer shared silence, they shared hostility. Every scene became a test, not only of stamina, but of endurance in the face of mutual disdain. The feud had crossed a line. It was no longer private, no longer deniable. It was visible, undeniable, and woven into the DNA of the production itself. What began as lateness had erupted into spectacle. And once the world sees a fire, you cannot pretend it never burned. The wasteland of Fury Road was fiction, but the wasteland between Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy was painfully real. And soon, that wasteland would swallow more than just their working relationship. It would reshape their careers, their reputations, and the legacy of the film itself.
When the cameras finally stopped rolling, the desert dust still clung to everything. Fury Road had been captured, but the scars of its making lingered. Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy had given performances that would redefine action cinema. Yet the cost was not measured in box office numbers. It was measured in reputations, in the way Hollywood would whisper their names for years after. For Theron, the ordeal hardened her resolve. She had always carried herself as a professional, and in her mind, the Fury Road chaos only proved why discipline mattered. She spoke later, cautiously, about the struggle. She admitted the environment was toxic. She confessed she felt unsafe at times, that the hostility had left her shaken. Her words were sharp, but not reckless. They painted a portrait of a woman demanding respect in a world that too often denied it. For many, her stance became emblematic, a symbol of the quiet wars women still fought in Hollywood. For Hardy, he took a different path. When confronted in interviews, his tone was half defensive, half apologetic. He admitted that Theron had been right, that her discipline had been necessary, and that his behavior had crossed lines. Yet even in apology, his aura carried contradiction. He was the storm that could never be fully contained. Some admired his honesty, others dismissed it as too little too late. The impact rippled through their careers. Theron emerged with her reputation reinforced. She was Furiosa, a warrior both on-screen and off. Hollywood saw her as unshakable, someone who demanded excellence and would not bend for chaos. Offers poured in and her legacy only deepened. For Hardy, the path was less smooth. His talent was undeniable, but so was his volatility. Directors whispered caution. Casting him meant brilliance, but also risk. The legend of Fury Road was not just the film, but the chaos of its making.
and Hardy carried that chaos like a shadow. The irony was cruel. Together, they had forged one of the greatest action films of their generation. Yet instead of binding them as co-creators of a masterpiece, the film split them apart. They rarely spoke of each other. When they did, it was cautious, clipped, as though any word could reopen wounds. For George Miller, the fallout was bittersweet. His film was hailed as a triumph, a cinematic revolution, showered with awards and acclaim. But he knew the price. He had seen the fractures up close, felt the weight of hostility every day on set. He had watched his vision nearly buckle under the strain of two stars who could not reconcile. To the world, Fury Road was lightning in a bottle. To him, it was lightning that had nearly burned the house down. The echoes of their clash followed them beyond Fury Road. When whispers of a sequel surfaced, speculation turned immediately to one question: would Theron and Hardy ever share the screen again? The answer, unspoken but understood, was no. The desert between them was too vast, the wounds too deep. Instead, Miller charted a new course, turning toward prequels and side stories, finding ways to continue his world without forcing its fractured icons back together. The lesson was clear. Hollywood is built on myths of collaboration, of stars coming together to create something larger than themselves. But the reality is messier. Sometimes the very friction that creates greatness also ensures that greatness cannot be repeated. For Theron and Hardy, Fury Road was both a peak and a dead end. Their paths diverged, not by choice, but by necessity. And yet, in the strange arithmetic of cinema, their feud became part of the legend. Fans whispered about the hostility, dissected the tension, argued whether the mistrust on-screen was performance or reality. Critics praised the authenticity, the rawness, never knowing how much of it was pulled straight from real disdain. The feud itself became a kind of myth, woven into the DNA of the film, inseparable from its legacy. Careers moved on, but the story never really ended. For Theron, every new role carried echoes of Furiosa, the woman who fought not only warlords on screen, but battles behind the camera. For Hardy, every unpredictable performance carried whispers of the desert, of the actor who turned chaos into art at a terrible cost. The conflict had started with lateness, with silence, with a crack too small to notice. It had erupted into spectacle, and then it had reshaped the paths of two stars who might have otherwise been allies. Instead, they became a cautionary tale, proof that even masterpieces can leave wreckage in their wake. The desert was long gone, but the scars it carved remained. And in Hollywood, scars never stay hidden. They turn into stories, stories turn into legends, and legends, no matter how painful, never die.
In Hollywood, time often softens edges, feuds fade, grudges dissolve, and stars who once clashed are brought back together by the lure of a new script or the weight of nostalgia. But for Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy, time did not bring peace, it only deepened the canyon between them. When Fury Road premiered, the world celebrated. Critics called it a masterpiece. Audiences sat in awe. Awards followed, filling shelves and rewriting what action cinema could be. On stage, Theron and Hardy stood side by side, dressed in smiles that looked polished but thin. Cameras captured their proximity, but behind the flashbulbs lived distance. They spoke of the film, of the vision, of George Miller, but rarely of each other. Even in triumph, the silence lingered. In the years that followed, whispers of reconciliation emerged. Some believed success would heal the wound. After all, they had survived the desert together, endured something few actors ever would. If shared suffering builds bonds, surely Fury Road would do the same. But the opposite was true. For Theron, the memory of hostility was a wound not easily closed. She spoke candidly of fear, of feeling unsafe on set, of needing protection, not from stunts or explosions, but from the man meant to be her co-star. Her words were measured, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Hardy, in moments of reflection, expressed regret. He admitted that he had been wrong, that his behavior had crossed lines. He acknowledged that Theron had carried a burden she should not have. To some, it sounded like humility. To others, it sounded like an apology too far removed from the battlefield to matter. There were attempts, subtle and quiet, to bring them together again. Industry events, interviews,
questions from journalists hoping for reconciliation. Each time, the answers were clipped. Each time, the gap remained. The desert had been too brutal, the scars too deep. George Miller himself considered whether their paths might cross again. When talk of sequels arose, speculations circled like vultures. Would Furiosa and Max return? Could Theron and Hardy find common ground if the cameras rolled once more? The answer came slowly, then firmly. No. The future of Fury Road would belong to new characters, new faces, new stories. The director who would once believe tension could fuel art now understood that some fractures could not be rebuilt. The tragedy of their feud was not only the hostility, but the loss of what could have been. Imagine a series of films with Theron and Hardy at the center, their chemistry sharpened not only by writing, but by history. Imagine a partnership where their differences became strength rather than poison. Instead, audiences were left with a single masterpiece, a single lightning strike that could never be repeated. Even when they spoke of each other in later years, the tone carried distance. Theron described the pain with clarity. Hardy described his guilt with caution. Both acknowledged the greatness of the film. Neither expressed desire to repeat it. Their words were like two parallel lines, running close but never touching, destined to remain apart. Hollywood thrives on reconciliation stories, but here there was none. No tearful reunion, no second act of redemption. Just silence, layered with memory. The silence became its own kind of story, proof that some wounds resist even the healing power of time. And yet the irony remained. Their mistrust had given Fury Road a heartbeat no script could have invented. Audiences felt the tension, the suspicion, the reluctant alliance. What was poison off-screen became gold on it. The feud had shaped a masterpiece, but the masterpiece ensured the feud would live forever. In another world, perhaps Theron and Hardy might have sat together years later, laughing at the chaos, admitting the wounds, forgiving the past. In this world, the desert kept its grip. The silence between them became permanent, a monument to what was lost. The failed attempts at reconciliation did not end in drama, not in shouting, not in spectacle. They ended in quiet refusal, in clipped answers, in two careers moving forward without ever intersecting again. That quiet was its own kind of explosion, one that echoed long after the dust had settled. For Fury Road fans, the disappointment was sharp. For Hollywood, the lesson was sobering. Greatness can emerge from conflict, but conflict often consumes the chance of greatness ever returning. Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy gave the world a masterpiece, then walked away from each other, leaving behind a legend wrapped not in unity, but in fracture. And perhaps that is why their story endures, not because they reconciled, but because they never did.
When the dust of Fury Road finally settled, the consequences stretched far beyond the Namibian desert. The feud between Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy became more than a behind-the-scenes rumor. It became part of the film's mythology, inseparable from its legacy. For Theron, the aftermath carried both pain and power. She spoke candidly about her experience, acknowledging the fear and hostility she endured. Her honesty sparked conversations across Hollywood about respect, about safety, about the invisible battles fought by women even at the highest levels of the industry. She emerged not only as Furiosa, the warrior of the wasteland, but as a voice for professionalism in a world that too often excused chaos as genius. The scars remained, but so did the respect she earned for speaking the truth. For Hardy, the consequences were more complicated. His raw talent remained undeniable, his performances magnetic, but his reputation carried the shadow of Fury Road. He admitted his faults, confessed his regret, and praised Theron for her discipline. Yet even in apology, the narrative of unpredictability clung to him. To work with Hardy was to gamble, to hope the brilliance outweighed the storm. Some directors were willing to take that risk. Others quietly stepped away. For George Miller, the aftermath was bittersweet. He had delivered a film hailed as one of the greatest of its time, a revolution in action storytelling. Fury Road won awards, claimed Oscars, and carved its name into cinema history. Yet, behind the triumph, he knew the cost. The feud had drained energy, divided his set, and ensured that a sequel with his original stars would never happen. He turned his gaze toward new characters, building prequels and side stories that allowed the franchise to continue without reopening old wounds. And for the crew who lived through it, the memories remained vivid. Some spoke of the hostility as unbearable. Others insisted it gave the film its edge, that the mistrust on screen was forged in real fire. They carried those memories long after the camera stopped rolling, a reminder that greatness often demands a price no one plans to pay. And for audiences, the feud became an echo, one that colored every rewatch. When Furiosa glares at Max, when Max avoids his eyes, when trust feels impossible, viewers cannot help but wonder how much of it was acting and how much was real. The film became not only a story about survival, but also a mirror of the war behind the camera. Years later, the consequences still ripple. Theron's Furiosa became iconic, inspiring spin-offs and prequels, though played by another actress. Hardy moved forward with roles that showcased his unpredictability, but the desert never left his shadow. Their feud became legend, a story told alongside the film itself, as if the conflict was just another character in the saga of Fury Road. In Hollywood, most feuds fade into gossip, forgotten as new headlines arrive. But this one endures. It endures because it left fingerprints on a masterpiece, because it turned performance into confession, because it revealed how fragile collaboration can be, even at the highest levels of the industry. The aftermath was not reconciliation. It was endurance. Both actors endured, the film endured, and the legend of their feud endures still.
Every story about conflict carries a lesson, and the feud between Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy is no exception. It shows that brilliance does not come without cost, that even masterpieces can be carved out of tension, mistrust, and pain. Fury Road stands as proof that art can survive war, but it also stands as a warning. The film gave audiences heroes bound by survival, yet its making revealed how fragile survival truly is when respect collapses. Theron fought for discipline, Hardy fought for freedom, and in the clash, they created something unforgettable. But unforgettable does not always mean unbreakable. Perhaps the real tragedy is not that they fought, but that their fight prevented what might have been. A partnership across multiple films, a bond forged in fire, a legacy shared instead of divided. Instead, the desert gave us only one chapter. And so the question lingers. Does greatness demand peace, or is it born from chaos? And if chaos creates beauty, is the price ever truly worth it?
Stories like this remind us that cinema is never just what appears on screen. Behind every frame, there are battles, sacrifices, and scars the audience never sees. The feud between Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy gave Fury Road its raw pulse, but it also left wounds that never healed. And that is the paradox of Hollywood. The legends we admire are often born in shadows we rarely acknowledge. If this story made you see Fury Road in a new light, if it made you think about the hidden costs behind the art you love, we want to hear from you. Do you believe conflict destroys, or do you believe it fuels greatness? Could Theron and Hardy have built something even larger had they found peace, or was the clash itself the secret ingredient? Share your thoughts in the comments, join the conversation, subscribe for more untold stories, and stay with us as we uncover the rivalries and broken bonds that shaped Hollywood's most iconic moments. In Hollywood, legends rise, but it is the fractures that never fade.